Welcome to the world's countries, from boring travel and geography for sleep, and to a small bonus episode that takes on a question which, at first glance, might seem simple, but which, like so many other geographical curiosities, turns out to be far more complicated once we start looking into the details. Today we are talking about islands, more specifically about which country actually has the most of them, and why the answer, somewhat frustratingly, depends entirely on how you choose to define and count them. The reason we're bringing this up now is a post from the Instagram account GeoSimplified, where they ranked the world's 10 most island-rich countries. At the top of their list we find Norway in first place, followed by Sweden, Finland, Canada, Chile, the United States, Indonesia, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. For most people who see such a list, it might be nothing more than a fun little fact, but for those of us who love geography, it can quickly become the start of a long and rather nerdy discussion. Because as soon as you share that list, someone will protest. And the protests often come with great conviction. No, that's wrong. It's Sweden that has the most islands, not Norway. And so you find yourself, almost without warning, in the middle of a debate that, on the surface, is about numbers, but which is really about definitions, measurement methods, and the very way we think about something as basic as what an island actually is. In this episode, we'll slow it all down, as we usually do. We'll look at what actually lies behind these rankings, how different countries count their islands, and why a list that looks neat and straightforward on Instagram can't really be read as a final answer. We'll use Norway and Sweden as our main examples, because that's where the debate often gets the most heated. But we'll also look at how the other countries on the list do their counting, and how that affects the results. Perhaps by the end you'll look at such lists in an entirely new way, or perhaps you'll simply have a deeper appreciation for how difficult it really is to compare numbers when the starting point is so different. So, take a deep breath, settle in, and let's begin right at the very bottom, with the most basic question of them all. What exactly is an island? It sounds like such a simple question, so obvious, in fact, that it hardly seems worth asking. We imagine a piece of land surrounded by water and think, there it is, an island. But the moment we try to put that into an official definition, uncertainty creeps in. How small can a piece of land be before we no longer call it an island? Is a rock sticking up above the sea surface an island? Or is it a skerry? Does an island have to be permanently above water? Or can it be visible only at low tide? Must it have vegetation? And what about islands and lakes? Do we count them in the same way as we do sea islands? Most countries have their own definitions, and they are not necessarily the same. In Norway, for instance, there is often a distinction between islands, islets, and skerries, with islands typically meaning land masses above a certain size, while islets and skerries are smaller and often without permanent vegetation. In Sweden, the National Statistics Agency, Statistiska Centralbyrån, has its own criteria, counting both coastal islands and those in lakes, but not necessarily applying the same minimum area threshold as Norway. In Finland, it's common to include a vast number of tiny lake islands in the total count, which creates a completely different composition from a country that only counts sea islands. Then there is the question of habitation. Should an island have been inhabited to be counted? In most official tallies, the answer is no. An island is an island whether or not anyone has ever lived there. But some datasets do distinguish between inhabitable islands and total islands, and that yields two very different rankings. There are also datasets that intentionally exclude the smallest forms of landmass, either because they are too small to be shown on maps at the chosen scale, or because they are essentially bare rocks barely rising above the waterline. When we move into more technical details, it becomes even more complex. Some countries base their counts on manual surveys that have been carried out over generations, mapping every tiny islet, while others use modern satellite imagery and digital map databases, with resolutions so high that thousands of tiny islands are detected that would have been overlooked in earlier surveys. Technology means that the number of recorded islands can rise dramatically from one count to the next, without a single new island actually appearing in reality. In other words, before we can even begin to compare the numbers in Geo-Simplified's list, we have to accept that we're not really comparing the same thing. We are looking at numbers that have been produced using different criteria, different technological methods, and, perhaps most importantly, different ideas of what an island actually is. And that means that any ranking, no matter how neat and appealing it looks in its final form, is ultimately the product of choices and definitions that may not be obvious to those who only see the end result. Let us begin with the country that tops the Geo-Simplified list, Norway. According to the Norwegian Mapping Authority, Kartverket, Norway has a total of 320,249 islands, islets, and skerries along its long, intricate coastline. This total is made up of 239,057 proper islands, meaning those above roughly 10 square meters in size, plus an additional 81,192 skerries and rocky outcrops that are smaller, bare, or otherwise excluded from the main island count. The Norwegian coastline is famously jagged and irregular, shaped over thousands of years by glacial erosion, creating a labyrinth of fjords, bays, and sheltered waters dotted with land masses of every imaginable size. In Norway's statistics, the distinction between an island and a skerry is important. A skerry is generally too small, too bare, or too exposed to be considered a proper island, but it still counts toward the total number of islands and skerries combined. This is one reason Norway's grand total rises above Sweden's, when everything is included. If you count only the larger, more substantial landmasses, Norway's figure drops and Sweden takes the lead. But if you include every last rock that permanently protrudes from the sea, Norway comes out on top. In Sweden, the official numbers come from Statistiska Centralbyrån, SCB, the National Statistics Agency. Their most recent figures state that Sweden has 267,570 islands. The definition here is broad. Any piece of land surrounded by water, regardless of whether it is in the sea or in a lake, and without imposing a strict minimum size limit. This approach means that Sweden's numbers include an enormous number of islands in its many lakes. Not only large and famous lakes such as Vänern and Vättern, but also thousands upon thousands of smaller lakes scattered across the country. Sweden's coastline is also home to vast archipelagos, particularly around Stockholm and along the east coast, where sheltered waters contain countless rocky islets. The Stockholm archipelago alone has around 30,000 islands and islets, many of them tiny and uninhabited. When only proper islands are counted, using criteria comparable to Norway's stricter definitions, Sweden's number is higher than Norway's, which is why some people insist that Sweden holds the title. But if you switch to counting everything, right down to the smallest permanent skerries, Norway surpasses it. Finland's place near the top of the list is due to a unique feature: the sheer number of islands within its lakes. The Finnish lakeland region contains tens of thousands of islands, from small forested hills rising from the water to tiny rocky outcrops barely large enough to stand on. According to official Finnish statistics, the country has more than 188,000 islands, and a remarkable proportion of these are in inland waters rather than along the coast. The coastal archipelago, particularly the one surrounding the Åland Islands, adds another layer of complexity. Åland itself is an autonomous region with its own internal statistics, and when you combine the coastal islands with those inland, the result is one of the most island-rich countries in the world. Though, like Norway and Sweden, Finland's exact number depends heavily on how finely you measure and how small an island you are willing to count. Canada's numbers come primarily from its Arctic territories, where remote and often ice-covered islands scatter across vast northern waters. Baffin Island, Ellesmere Island, and Victoria Island are among the largest, but in between them lie countless small islands, many of which are seasonally surrounded by ice rather than open water. Canada's counting methods vary by province and territory, and some tallies include islands that are technically connected to the mainland by ice for much of the year. The country's long Pacific and Atlantic coastlines, including the intricate shores of British Columbia and the maritime provinces, add further to the total. Chile's coastline stretches along the entire southwestern edge of South America, ending in the twisting, broken landscapes of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego. In this southern region, glaciers and fjords create a geography reminiscent of Norway's, filled with channels and scattered islands of every size. Chile's statistics tend to group small islets together, so official counts vary, but the southern archipelagos are the main reason it ranks so high. In the United States, Alaska alone contains the majority of the country's islands. The Aleutian Chain, the Alexander Archipelago, and numerous coastal islands boost the total. The Great Lakes also contribute significantly, especially islands in Lake Huron and Lake Superior. Official U.S. counts depend on federal and state mapping standards, which are not always consistent with one another. Indonesia is famous for its thousands of islands, though the exact number is a matter of debate. The official figure often cited is over 17,000, but the range in different reports can be wide. This is partly due to the fact that many small islands are unnamed, uninhabited, and sometimes only emerge at low tide. Indonesia's official counts tend to focus on islands with established names or some form of recognition in government records. Japan's official number of islands recently changed dramatically. For many years, the figure was just over 6,800, but a new count using more detailed mapping raised that number to 14,125 in 2023. This did not mean that new islands appeared. It was simply the result of using higher resolution data, which detected thousands of smaller landmasses that had previously been missed. Australia's island count includes large, well-known islands like Tasmania, as well as numerous smaller islands and reefs along both the Pacific and Indian Ocean coasts. Definitions vary by state, and some counts exclude sandbars or coral cays that are regularly submerged, while others include them. The Philippines officially recognizes 7,641 islands, but the number changes over time as surveys improve and tidal data shifts. Many of these islands are small and uninhabited, while others are home to large populations and cities. As with Indonesia, the choice of what to count plays a significant role in the final number. At first glance, a ranked list of countries with the most islands seems like a straightforward fact, much like the highest mountains or the longest rivers. You see the numbers lined up from largest to smallest, and you assume that they are directly comparable. But with islands, this is rarely the case, because the methods used to produce those numbers differ so much from one country to another that we are not, in reality, measuring the same thing. One of the main reasons is technology. The resolution of mapping data can change the numbers dramatically. Countries that have relied on older surveys, where cartographers drew coastlines by hand based on aerial photographs or field expeditions, will inevitably miss thousands of tiny land masses that high-resolution satellite imagery can now detect. When Japan's official island count almost doubled in 2023, it wasn't because the sea had suddenly parted to reveal new land. It was because modern geospatial data revealed what was already there, but too small or indistinct to be recorded before. Then there is the issue of classification. Some countries count any piece of land surrounded by water as an island, no matter how small, bare, or inaccessible. Others set minimum size thresholds. Anything smaller is excluded or categorized as a skerry, a rock, or some other non-island feature. The choice of threshold has a huge impact on the final number. Norway's count, for example, changes significantly depending on whether you include only proper islands or add every skerry and rock outcrop. Geography adds another layer of complexity. Countries with many inland lakes, such as Finland and Sweden, will naturally have enormous island totals if they include lake islands in their statistics. Coastal countries with long, broken shorelines like Norway and Chile will also score highly if they include every feature along their coastlines. Meanwhile, tropical island nations such as Indonesia and the Philippines might have thousands of islands spread across open ocean. But their official counts often focus on named or inhabited islands, leaving many small features uncounted. Climate and environmental change can also shift the numbers. Rising sea levels may submerge some low-lying islands, while erosion and storms can reshape coastlines, altering what qualifies as a separate landmass. In glaciated or tidal regions, some islands may connect to the mainland at low tide and only be separate at high tide, creating further ambiguity in whether they count. In short, the problem with these rankings is not that they are wrong, but that they are built on foundations that are not uniform. Comparing them is a bit like comparing the heights of mountains measured from different base points. Each number might be correct within its own system, but the systems are not aligned. The result is that a country's position on a list may say more about its definitions, mapping methods, and geographic choices than it does about the actual physical reality of its islands. Among all the entries on GeoSimplified's list, none generate as much discussion, sometimes polite, sometimes a little more heated, as the rivalry between Norway and Sweden over which country truly has the most islands. On the surface, it feels like a simple matter of checking the numbers and seeing which one is bigger. But as we have already seen, those numbers change shape depending on the rules you use, and in the case of Norway and Sweden, the rules are not the same. If we take Norway's statistics from Kartverket and limit ourselves to proper islands, those above a certain size threshold, often around 10 square meters, and excluding skerries and small rock outcrops, the total comes to 239,057. Using comparable definitions for Sweden, Statistiska Centralbyrån lists 267,570 islands. By that measure, Sweden wins. This is the version of the story that most people who argue for Sweden's crown are using. It is simple, tidy, and feels decisive. But the picture changes if we alter the criteria. Norway's coastline is famously jagged, with fjords, inlets, and archipelagos that produce an extraordinary number of small islets and skerries. If you include these smaller features in the count, everything that is permanently above water, regardless of size or vegetation, the Norwegian total rises to 320,249. Sweden's count also rises if you include its smallest features, but not by enough to surpass Norway's new, expanded number. By this broader definition, Norway comes out on top. This is why both statements, Sweden has the most islands and Norway has the most islands, can be true depending on the parameters. If you are counting larger islands and ignoring skerries, Sweden wins. If you are counting absolutely everything, Norway wins. The real disagreement, then, is not over the numbers themselves, but over which set of rules is the right one. And there is no single, universally agreed answer to that. Part of the tension also comes from the fact that the two countries are neighbors with a long and complicated history, full of shared culture, but also of rivalry. A claim like "we have more islands" may sound trivial, but it becomes another small point in a broader, centuries-old back and forth over identity, pride, and national bragging rights. The fact that both countries are so visually defined by their coastlines, and that island life is a part of their shared heritage, makes the question feel more personal than it might for other nations. If you read the comment sections under social media posts about this topic, you will see the same cycle play out. Someone posts a ranking that shows Norway in first place. Swedes arrive to point out that this is wrong if you count only real islands. Norwegians reply with the larger total that includes skerries, and the discussion loops endlessly from there. In the end, the debate may never be resolved. Not because one side is refusing to accept reality, but because reality looks slightly different depending on the lens you choose to use. And for those of you in the comments, especially our confident Swedish friends who are absolutely sure you know the real island champion, why not put that world knowledge to the test? Check out Prisoners of the Quiz book by Tim Marshall. Over 300 geography questions, puzzles, and map challenges to see if you're truly the ultimate armchair explorer. Link in the episode description. While Norway and Sweden often dominate the conversation about island counts, the rest of the countries on Geo-Simplified's list each have their own unique reasons for ranking so highly. Some are there because of geography shaped by ice and rock, others because of tropical seas and coral formations, and still others because of lakes so vast and numerous that they rival small seas. Looking at them one by one helps us understand how different landscapes can produce the same result: a land scattered into countless separate pieces. Finland sits high on the list because of its extraordinary inland waterways. The Finnish lakeland is a dense, interwoven system of lakes, channels, and rivers, dotted with tens of thousands of islands, many of them forested and uninhabited. Unlike countries that get their island totals mainly from coastal waters, Finland's numbers are overwhelmingly inland, with only a modest contribution from its Baltic Sea coastline. The Åland Islands, an autonomous archipelago in the Baltic, add to the total, but it is the inland lakes that give Finland its remarkable figures. Canada earns its place through sheer scale. Its Arctic region is home to enormous islands like Baffin, Victoria, and Ellesmere. But between these giants lie countless smaller islands, many rarely visited and covered in snow or ice for much of the year. Canada's Pacific coast, particularly around British Columbia, adds further complexity, with deep fjords and island groups that resemble parts of Norway's coastline. Even the Great Lakes have their share of islands, some large enough to host communities, others tiny specks in the water. Chile owes its position to the wild, fragmented landscapes of its far south. Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego are a maze of fjords, channels, and broken land, the product of glaciers carving through mountains and valleys over thousands of years. In some places, the sea and land are so tangled together that it is difficult to say where one ends and the other begins. Many of Chile's islands are remote and uninhabited, swept by fierce winds and cold currents, but together they make up a vast and complex coastal geography. The United States appears here mainly because of Alaska. The Aleutian Islands stretch far into the Pacific, while the Alexander Archipelago in the southeast is a labyrinth of forested islands separated by narrow channels. In the rest of the country, there are also island groups in the Great Lakes, the Florida Keys, and along the Atlantic coast. The U.S. count depends heavily on how individual states and federal agencies define an island, meaning that different surveys sometimes produce noticeably different totals. Indonesia is a country almost defined by its islands, so much so that it is often described as the world's largest archipelago nation. The official figure, usually quoted at over 17,000 islands, varies depending on the criteria and the year of the survey. Many islands are uninhabited, and some are only exposed at low tide. Indonesia's spread across the equator means it contains islands in a huge range of environments, from volcanic peaks to low coral atolls, each adding to the complexity of its geography. Japan recently revised its official count in a way that perfectly illustrates how technology changes statistics. For many years, Japan was said to have just over 6,800 islands. But in 2023, A new count using more detailed mapping revealed 14,125 islands, more than twice the earlier total. Not a single new island had actually formed. They had simply gone unrecorded before. These range from the 4 large main islands to countless smaller ones scattered along the coasts. Australia combines large, well-known islands like Tasmania with thousands of smaller ones along its Pacific and Indian Ocean shores. The Great Barrier Reef region alone contains many coral cays and sandy islets, though whether these are counted as islands depends on the criteria. Some states exclude features that are regularly submerged, while others include them in their totals, which makes it difficult to give a definitive national figure. The Philippines has an official count of 7,641 islands, though this number changes over time as surveys improve and new tidal information emerges. Many of the islands are small and uninhabited, while others are home to bustling cities and millions of people. Like Indonesia, the Philippines is spread over a wide area, and its islands vary from mountainous volcanic peaks to flat coral platforms. Looking at these countries together, it becomes clear that there is no single type of island-rich nation. Some have their numbers concentrated in one region, such as Alaska or the Finnish lakes, while others are scattered across entire oceans. Some count every rock and reef, while others focus on larger, named islands. Each country's figure is as much a reflection of its history, mapping practices, and definitions as it is of its actual physical geography. When people see a ranking of countries with the most islands, it is tempting to treat it as a kind of prize table. First place feels like a victory, second place a near miss, and so on down the list. But the truth is that these numbers do not always mean what we imagine they do. Having the most islands does not necessarily mean having the most variety, the most coastline, or the most places that people can actually live on. In fact, many of the islands included in these impressive totals are small, bare, and inhospitable. In Norway's case, a large part of the count comes from skerries, low, rocky outcrops that may be only a few meters across and completely exposed to wind and waves. They are beautiful to look at, often forming the dramatic seascapes that Norway is famous for, but they are not habitable in any practical sense. Sweden's figures include thousands of lake islands that may be lush and green, but many are just small forested bumps, far from any settlement and accessible only by boat. Finland's inland islands create a landscape of great beauty, but many are equally remote and unused. In tropical archipelagos like Indonesia and the Philippines, there are more islands that can sustain human life year-round, but even here, many remain uninhabited. Some are little more than sandbars or coral heads, swept clean by storms or tides. Others may have been inhabited in the past, but are now abandoned for economic or environmental reasons. So when we hear most islands, we have to remember that the number itself is only one dimension of the picture. It tells us something about the complexity of a country's geography, but not necessarily about how that geography is used or experienced. A country might have fewer islands but more large, habitable ones. Another might have a vast number of islands but very little land area in total once you add them all up. There is also the matter of perception. For people living in coastal or island-rich countries, islands may be part of everyday life. Places for fishing, recreation, summer cabins, or even year-round homes. In other parts of the world, islands may feel exotic and remote, part of a distant landscape that exists only in travel brochures. This means that most islands can sound like a more romantic title than it actually is, because it conjures images of tropical beaches or charming villages rather than bare rock and cold surf. And then there is the point that perhaps matters most to geographers. These numbers are not fixed forever. As mapping technology changes, definitions shift, and environmental conditions evolve, the counts will change too. Japan's sudden jump in 2023 is a reminder that we are still discovering what we thought we already knew. A list that feels definitive today may look different in a few years, not because the physical world has changed dramatically, but because our ability to measure and define it has improved. In the end, the value of these rankings is not so much in the bragging rights they offer, but in the conversations they start. They prompt us to ask what an island really is, how we decide what counts, and how our tools and perspectives shape the answers we give. And in that sense, most islands becomes less about a number and more about a story of coastlines, lakes, and seas, of rocks and reefs and sandbars, of people and places and the ways we draw boundaries around the world we live in. So, after all of this, where does that leave us? We began with a neat little Instagram list from GeoSimplified, showing 10 countries ranked by the number of islands they have. It seems simple, but as we've seen, the simplicity fades the moment you look closely. The numbers on that list are not universal measurements. They are the products of national definitions, mapping techniques, and decisions about what to include and what to leave out. Norway can rightly claim to have the most islands if we count every rock and skerry that rises permanently above the water. Sweden can just as rightly claim the top spot if we limit ourselves to larger islands, using stricter criteria. Both statements can be true. We've seen that Finland's numbers are dominated by inland lake islands, Canada's by its Arctic archipelagos, and Chile's by the fragmented coastlines of Patagonia. The United States owes much of its count to Alaska, while Indonesia and the Philippines spread their islands across vast stretches of ocean. Japan's total doubled almost overnight when new mapping data revealed thousands of features that had always been there but had never been counted before. Australia's tally depends partly on whether you include features that disappear beneath the waves. In each case, the number is a reflection not only of geography but of the way it is observed, recorded, and defined. And that is perhaps the quiet lesson of this entire discussion, that even something as seemingly solid as counting islands is shaped by human choices. We decide what qualifies, we decide how to measure, and in doing so, we shape the answers we find. It means that a ranking of most islands is never an absolute truth carved in stone, but rather a snapshot in time, a reflection of our current knowledge and our current ways of seeing. If there is one thing to take away from this episode, it might be that the world is always more complex than it looks from a distance. The numbers in a chart or the names in a ranking are just the surface. Beneath them lie definitions, histories, and decisions that can change the picture entirely. So the next time you see a list like this, perhaps you'll pause, just for a moment, and wonder not only about the numbers themselves, but about the choices that brought them into being. And with that, we'll leave our little exploration of island counts here. Whether you are listening from a place surrounded by water or far inland, whether your own landscape is dotted with islands or entirely without them, I hope this quiet journey has been a reminder of how much there is to discover in even the simplest of questions. Thank you for joining me, and as always, if you know these places well, if you've walked the skerries of Norway, sailed among Sweden's archipelagos, or crossed the lake islands of Finland, I would love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, when we'll set our course for another corner of the map, I wish you calm waters, clear skies, and a safe harbor for the night.